another adventurer to the slaughter. Many have entered, but none have returned.
What if I hit those big red things?
No,
I mean, I'm gonna try it though. It's definitely your weak spot.
I have no weaknesses.
This says it's your weak spot.
It's not a weak spot. Please don't. Please don't.
Why don't you talk to me? Why don't you talk to me? I'm standing here alone. I know you'll never phone. Why don't you talk to me?
Pressure to churn out more surefire hits, fast. Employees compared the long-term effects of the acquisition to becoming a lifeless factory, or being taken over by the Borg from Star Trek.
Say it to my face so we can leave this place. Why don't you talk to me? What you're thinking, I will never know. Now's the time.
Further evolving the engine that began with Magic Carpet and was later revised for Dungeon Keeper, Bullfrog set out to make their first God game since Molyneux's departure. Bringing Populous to a new generation after a lengthy 7-year hiatus, the third and final entry to the series made sweeping changes, both lauded and controversial. Populous the Beginning is a real-time strategy game with God game elements. This time around, you no longer soar over the world using miracles wherever you see fit. Instead, you channel your abilities through the Shaman. She is both your most powerful asset in the game and the thing you must protect most.
It's just me and you. It's just me and you. There's no one for you to hide behind. Stop pretending that the problem's mine. Lift your head and look me dead in the eye. What made you so bitter inside? Why don't you talk to me? Why don't you talk to me? Because I'm standing here, I got an open ear. Why don't you talk to me? Go, 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 come on, spit it out. Rolls off your tongue, right out your pretty mouth. You've got to say it to believe it, got to say it to believe it, got to say it, got to say it, say it, say it, say it. Say, why don't you talk to me? Why don't you talk to me? Why don't you talk to me? Talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me. To me. Talk. Why don't you talk
It isn't obvious often whether you own something or it owns you. And I don't mean that in a flippant sense.
Oh, I
mean,
wouldn't at
knew-
all. Recently, I was investing in, people doing cryptocurrency now. It's like invisible. I don't even know what it is, but people are excited by it. And I started to notice those markets on this crypto thing. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, Doctor.
No, please, go ahead.
Thanks. But I noticed, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I would check this thing. And finally, I realized, whatever monies I'm going to possibly make in this portal, this gambling portal of cryptocurrency, which no judgment on it. I don't know enough about it to really judge it, but I'm spending important time checking it. I realized I became a slave to it. And so I just sold it all. I don't want, in my heart and in my chest, it didn't feel good having that distraction to check all the time about what was going on with this money. It just felt like it owned me. And I immediately decided, you know what, I just don't want to be owned by this. Maybe something else, but just not this,
Right, and was it specifically the worry about it that was bothering you? Or what do you think triggered or alerted you to the fact that pursuit wasn't for you?
That's a great question. I think it was, I couldn't control myself. This is the truth. I couldn't control myself from checking it. And so the only alternative I had was to eliminate it because I was
Right.
really having trouble. And it doesn't fully answer your question, but I was just having trouble stop checking it. So I just said I have to get rid of it.
Well, it answers it to some degree. You found, to your surprise. See, this is partly what we were talking earlier about not hiding things in the fog. This is part of the process of coming to a clearer vision of yourself, is noticing exactly that. Because your theory was, well, I can buy this cryptocurrency and maybe I'll make some money, but regardless, one way or another, this is going to make my life better. You
Right.
had a theory of yourself and you had a theory of the money.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that that was wrong. Now, why exactly, we don't know. But the consequence of that was that you became a slave to a set of impulses that you didn't find enjoyable in the least.
Yeah.
And that is, and so then you stop doing it, and fair enough. That seems to be the right solution.
Hope you enjoyed that video, and you can watch another. And you can watch this one, you can watch this one. Different options, different choices. Some guy just brings you one option, not this guy. Two options. Watch one, this one or this one.
You said in that book, Orwell got the three basic questions of the 20th century right: imperialism, fascism, and communism. And that sums up his political and literary achievement as well as any single appraisal.
I always feel they derived from each other. In other words, from what he saw about imperialism, especially the sort of sexual repression and racism that is involved, I think he found it quite easy to decode the appeal of fascism and the danger of it. It was to some extent an extension of imperialism, not purely, but to a good deal.
Yeah.
To a good deal. In many ways, that was the case. And then, because it's funny, he hardly writes anything about fascism. He seems to just assume everyone will know that it's evil and needs to be fought against. There's
right.
almost nothing strange. There's almost no analysis of it. He takes it for granted that it's completely unacceptable. But it's in the course of fighting against one kind of totalitarianism that he discovers that there are many people claiming to be his allies who are not.
Yes.
And that actually there's an almost equally dangerous illusion taking place on the other side of the Urals.
That's right. And he turned the same withering scrutiny on his own side that he had turned on a much easier target: Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Franco's Spain. And that was when he made most of his enemies, on the left and all the way to the end of his life. Yeah.
Now, I realize I haven't said quite enough about you. I should perhaps have said some of this at the beginning, but those of you who don't know him already or know his work, Mr. Packer, first came to my attention actually as a novelist, writing from Africa, in fact. And like Orwell, was capable of fiction, very enviably, as well as of the long essay form by which I would think you're now probably reaching a larger audience. Mr. Packer's work, especially from Iraq, and other parts of the world, but especially from Iraq, in the New Yorker, has got him a great deal of attention. And I believe you now have a collection of essays of your own.
I do. A new book out called Interesting Times, Writings from a Turbulent Decade. But back to fiction.
Yes.
You probably overpraised me there. I did write two novels. They were read by about 35 people. And although I learned a lot from writing them, I did not learn to be a novelist, I don't think. Orwell wrote a batch of novels in the 1930s that were in the tradition of Anglo-American realism. And I love them. I don't know how you feel about them, but for me, Keep the Aspidistra Flying is just a marvelous book. Burmese Days is the one that really lasts the longest, but you just don't feel that Orwell's working in his most natural grain in those novels. You feel the essayist sort of pushing through the illusion of fiction all the time. He has something to say. He has an argument to make. He has something, a proposition about the world all the time. And he doesn't have the restraint and patience of a natural fiction writer. And that's why we can be grateful that he once wrote in, I think in Why I Write, that if he'd been left to his own devices, he would have been a kind of 19th century British novelist like his heroes Dickens and Gissing. But events and the turbulence of the 30s and 40s pushed him into becoming what he called a kind of pamphleteer.
Species of pamphleteer.
Yeah. And
By
that,
the way, I have to interrupt this. It's one of the very few completely unconvincing things I think he ever wrote.
absolutely. I was just going to say that because really it was not events that pushed him in that direction. It was his own inclination.
Yes. Also, it's a very rare case of him being too conceited. In other words, he said, if it wasn't for all these polemics I have to write, I could have been Charles Dickens. Well, come on, you know, I mean, that's a bit much. The Burmese was saying in Burma that he flattered them by writing 3 novels about their country. Burmese Days, Animal Farm, in 1984.
Right. I actually heard that line in Burma last year when I went there.
Did you?
Oh, yes, Orwell is still a huge presence in Burma. All the more, I think now there's a young generation who did not learn English well growing up. They came after the generation that was schooled by the British. They've had their futures utterly blighted by the totalitarian regime there. And Orwell speaks to them not just because he wrote about Burma, but as you say, because he wrote about totalitarianism. 1984 has so many echoes in Burma today, and so you can actually find Animal Farm being sold discreetly in bookstalls on the streets of Rangoon. And so he's he's reemerged as a hero to these younger Burmese writers after being condemned for his supposed imperialism by the junta.
And while we're on contemporary totalitarianism, which we might as well stay with a bit, I've been in North Korea, and you know, when one goes as a reporter, one hopes to avoid cliche. And so I thought I'm going to try not to mention 1984, because everyone says it's an Orwellian stage. It's a funny use of the word Orwellian.
Yeah.
But in fact, the great thing about totalitarianism is that it is a cliche.
It seems to do the same thing over and over again.
Kim Il-sung founded the North Korean state the same year that 1984 came out.
Right.
And it's as if someone gave him a novel in Korean and said, do you think we could make this work? And he thinks, well, I don't know, but we'll sure give it our best shot. It's absolutely remarkable.
Life imitated art.
Yes, and it's the same when people in countries like this come across Orwell, as the North Koreans one day will, they're amazed. I think the greatest compliment perhaps ever paid to one writer by another in the 20th century was by Czesław Miłosz, when he, in The Captive Mind, when he wrote about the situation in Stalinist Poland. He said, there is a book in circulation. It's called 1984. You can only get it privately. It's circulated with great secrecy and fear among the inner party. And he said, I personally was very surprised, as we all were, to find out he'd never visited the Soviet Union. Because how could he get the texture? How could he get the texture of it all so right without having had this experience? Now, remember, 1984 is about the circulation of an illegal book within the inner party, among other things. So it's extraordinary.
But that is a great question. How did Orwell know? He lived almost his entire life in England. He traveled a bit through Europe at the end of World War II. He had his years in Burma. But other than that, he was very parochial. He was confined to the island. And yet he wrote in his essay on Arthur Koestler that the British writers of his generation had failed to understand totalitarianism because they had not lived it the way Koestler, Salone, Camus, and other continental writers had. And so he was sort of criticizing what he called the parlor Bolsheviks, Auden, Spender, etc., for not feeling what it is to live under that kind of regime. Orwell felt it, but he had the same, other than his years in Burma and his suffering and hard times in the 30s, which they did not have. He had the same education and lived in the same England that they did, and yet he did feel it. And it's a bit of a mystery how he could have known it so well.
Well, I think I have a possible solution, and also a slight correction to you. In reverse order, then, or correction first. Not as insular as all that. After all, he did spend a lot of time in the Far East, admittedly as a colonial policeman, but I think being a colonial cop gave him an insight into the master-servant, indeed almost master-slave relationship. Very useful in describing some of the, again, dirty secret sexual underlay of totalitarianism. Then he was in Spain, and he was in Barcelona at a time when the Communist Party did briefly take over, and there was a police terror. And third, very important, he noticed that all the truth about Spain had been written out of the record. And he wrote, looking back on the Spanish War, he was really afraid that this was becoming a habit now in Europe. that if the leader says something never happened, then it never did. And you can see the germ of 1984
Done
coming.
partly by the father of your old nation colleague, Claude Coburn, father of Alexander Coburn.
Yes, and by, not just by communists. I mean, quite a lot of other people fell for the line that the Communist Party was the best defender of the Spanish Republic. And it's only very recently that the archives of both Franco's system and the Stalinist system have been opened, and we do know what happened in those May days in Barcelona. And actually what Orwell said was happening was in every detail true.
Yeah.
He refused the lie. But then
yeah.
the second point I want to make is about going on with his insularity, is his first real book is written in French, down out in Paris and London. It was originally a French book. He spoke very good French. He spoke at least 2 Indian and Burmese languages.
Well, it wasn't written in French. He wrote the essays in it, the sketches in English. He wrote a couple of little essays for a small French publication called Le Progrès Civique,
Yes.
back when he was in Paris.
Including a long essay on colonialism in Burma.
That's right,
in French.
that's right. And then wrote the manuscript of Down and Out, which which was rejected by T.S. Eliot and some of the other major...
Did Eliot reject Down and Out in Paris and
No,
London?
it was rejected by, yeah, I think it was Eliot. He was at Faber in 1931 or 32 and rejected, and then rejected Animal Farm
Yes.
many years later.
Yes.
So he and Orwell had
As did
connection.
Harcourt Brace in America. One of the best rejection letters I think ever written. Every aspiring writer should have this rejection letter pasted in their hat to consult. It says, "Dear Mr. Orwell, thank you for letting us look at your manuscript, Animal Farm. Unfortunately, it's impossible to sell stories about animals in the United States.
That's right.
So in the country of Disney, they could make such a fatuous remark,
now
and they
they-
really thought it was a story about the farmyard."
And then Animal Farm became a very good cartoon film. So it is, they were wrong about that too.
Commissioned by the CIA.
Yeah, but just to get back to the experience of reading Orwell and the essays in this book, when I started reading him, and I don't know if you had this experience, I didn't know much about fascism or communism or imperialism. I was looking more for an example of how a writer carried himself in the world and how to transform experience into sentences, and how to do it in a way that didn't call more attention to the self than to the experience. And in Why I Write, Orwell wrote, "Good prose is like a window pane." Another maybe dubious claim, but helpful in the sense that his words are always pointing to the thing and not back to the self. And they reveal so much about a character. I mean, there's something almost, you feel you know him when you read his essays. You feel you know how he speaks, you can hear his voice, you know his irritations, you know how he's going to react if you say something. He's almost alive with you, even though there's also a certain remoteness to Orwell. He doesn't let you in on everything in his life. He doesn't talk about his marriage very much in his writing. He doesn't talk about his child, Richard Orwell. He doesn't talk about his parents. Some of the basic things that American memoirists make, gold out of that are the subjects of book after book. For Orwell, were kind of off limits. He was a bit constrained, maybe by late Victorian shibboleths that way, but nonetheless, you have this very strong sense of the person behind the words, and that was what first drew me to him and makes those essays, worth reading over and over again.
Now, I've talked about this before, but George Orwell probably named his infamous book 1984 after the Fabian Socialists, as after all, they were founded in 1884, and they were explicitly proponents of gradualism, change over time progressively through the decades, so a century would be a very notable marker. Like a lot of people, I was taught 1984 in high school, and it was actually the book that my English teacher really taught us how to analyze literature with, how to read between the lines and pick things apart. And like a lot of people, I had to write an essay comparing 1984 to Brave New World and answering the question of which one was more likely to come true, which dystopian future was more imminent. But it took me many years to realize the connections behind the scenes of those books. George Orwell, aka Eric Blair, had actually been a pupil of Aldous Huxley. I believe he learned French from him at the Eton boarding school. And by that time I realized who Aldous Huxley's family was. T.H. Huxley, the bulldog Darwin, his brother Julian Huxley, and the role they played in eugenics and their promotion of the New Age, the New Order of the Ages. Also their connection to H.G. Wells and similar figures, and their connection to Fabian socialism. And back when we were first reading 1984, of course, one of the questions that came up was, what does the title mean? Where did Eric Blair, George Orwell get the idea from? And the most common story you'll hear is that, well, he finished it in 1948, and he and his publisher talked about it, and they didn't know what to call it, so they just inversed the numbers, 1948, 84, end of story. They decided against his alternate title, The Last Man in Europe. But of course, that story doesn't make any sense, and there's no proof that it's true. Although it's never been explained, a much more likely explanation comes in the fact that his wife, Eileen Blair, before they had met when she was still Eileen O'Shaughnessy, had just read Brave New World, which was published in 1932, and she wrote a poem in 1934 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of her high school, Sutherland High School magazine, that she called End of the Century 1984. It was a relatively short poem with a death, birth, and phoenix section, where society basically dies, and the old authors, Shakespeare, Yeats, Horace, Virgil, and what have you, are outmoded, and their books are dusty and distant. And in the New Age, his wife hints at crystal palaces and sun-bronzed scholars who learn by tuning their thought to telepathic Station 9, where they learn the useful sciences and the arts of telesalesmanship. In the Phoenix section, she connects old authors with new, and says that Huxley shares Platonic food, while Bacon's colleague is Einstein. So, at any rate, Orwell's wife was only 39 years old when she died, which happened to be in the final year of World War II. And pretty much the only major thing Orwell did with the rest of his life was write 1984. It makes sense that his title was in many ways a tribute to the poem she wrote, End of the Century 1984. And again, Orwell came to know Aldous Huxley personally, studied under him, and later Huxley issued basically a rebuttal to 1984, and Huxley, who moved in very high circles, introduced George Orwell to a lot of very influential people, many of them part of the Fabian socialists. And Huxleys themselves were involved, but maybe not official members. Bertrand Russell was involved, and they were very close with the founders, including H.G. Wells, who was very much a Huxley acolyte himself, having basically risen to prominence under T.H. Huxley's tutelage. So through that connection, George Orwell came to know a lot of these people and came to despise a lot of them and talk bad about them. Well, the first publication by the Fabians in 1884 was Why Are the Many Poor? And it talked about how to remedy by reallocating wealth of the rich and powerful, dismantling structures and building social institutions that were supposedly more equitable. And it contains the famous quote that is attributed to the Roman general Fabius Maximus, from where the Fabians get their name, as well as their implemented gradualism. Why are the many poor proclaimed, quote, for the right moment you must wait, as Fabius did most patiently when warring against Hannibal, though many censured his delays. But when the time comes, you must strike hard, as Fabius did, or you will be waiting in vain and fruitless. And so that relates directly to one of the Fabian's several logos, which is that of a turtle, an angry tortoise, slowly moving along. How does he beat the rabbit in the race to the finish line? Well, he moves steadily, progressively, gradually. But when I strike hard. And so the Fabians were in favor of a full move into socialism and a takeover of the state and society, but from a practical standpoint, they thought it should be implemented gradually. But there's also their coat of arms, which is quite telling, and that is a depiction of a wolf in sheep's clothing, a deception. And reading from the website ForbiddenSymbols.com on the Fabian Society reads, according to author John Perdue, the logo of the Fabian Society, a tortoise, represents the group's predilection for a slow, imperceptible transition to socialism, while its coat of arms, a wolf in sheep's clothing, represented its preferred methodology for achieving its goal. But the wolf in sheep's clothing symbolism was later abandoned due to its obvious negative connotations. And even though Orwell, aka Eric Blair, was very much a socialist, a proud socialist, he took very serious issue with a lot of the leading socialists, especially from the Fabian corner. And he saw them as basically middle class and upper class and snobbish and hateful of the poor and very, very cold. There was actually an essay written by Arnold Toynbee, the longtime president of the Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and he wrote an essay in his book Acquaintances about the Webs titled Are They Human?, where he lays out all these examples of how they're very cold human beings, and everybody knows that, and they've called them out, and they're very calculating. But a couple times he saw them be nice to people, and they didn't really have to be. And that was when he knew, yeah, they're human. And Orwell saw a lot of the same behavior, and he wrote a great deal about this in his book, The Road to Wigan Pier, which was published in 1937. About a year, I think, before he published his other essay on Wells, Hitler, and the World State, where he just laid out all the things wrong with H.G. Wells' thinking and undermining Hitler. In the same sort of time period in The Road to Wigan Pier, Orwell takes to task George Bernard Shaw and the Webbs, all of whom were founders of the Fabian Socialists, who founded it, by the way, along with Edward R. Peace, who was very wealthy and actually worked on the London Stock Exchange before he received a huge inheritance that allowed him to basically retire and start funding all these labor and socialism causes. Very rich irony. Anyway, Orwell writes in chapter 11, meanwhile, what about socialism? And he writes a lot about socialism. He's in favor of socialism, but he's extremely critical of their complete detachment in the literary circles and the academia circles and the literary circles from the working people, the honest and hardworking people who they see as dirty and unclean and unlearned and just have this whole attitude. And after he takes George Bernard Shaw to task for not only being snobbish and demeaning towards working class people, but for supporting dictators and even suggesting that poverty and the habits of mind created by poverty are something to be abolished from above by violence if necessary, as well as his support for both Stalin and Mussolini, he gets into Miss Sidney Webb's autobiography, which would be Beatrice Webb, where Orwell says, quote, "You get the same thing in a more mealy-mouthed form in Miss Sidney Webb's autobiography, which gives unconsciously a most revealing picture of the high-minded socialist slum visitor. The truth is that to many people calling themselves socialist," Orwell writes, "revolution does not mean a movement of the masses with which they hope to associate themselves. It means a set of reforms which, quote, we, the clever ones, are going to impose upon, quote, them, the lower orders. On the other hand, it would be a mistake to regard the book-trained socialist as a bloodless creature entirely capable of emotion. Though seldom giving much evidence for affection for the exploited, he is perfectly capable of displaying hatred, a sort of queer theoretical in vacua hatred against the exploiters." And he goes into how they basically denounce the bourgeois and the upper class lifestyle, yet they live it themselves. They ascribe to it. They come on in. They live that way. And hardly would they ever be caught dead, with the mannerisms of the poor and working class. They wouldn't slurp their soup. They wouldn't drink after people. They saw those people as disgusting. So yeah, wolf in sheep's clothing. I mean, this is a deceptive movement. And, H.G. Wells even published a book called The Open Conspiracy. And,
pretty simple. Just go to the LC King channel. The Stephen Hawking model is a joke. The Big Bang is a joke. Flava Flav 911 is a joke. It's all 911 is a joke in Yorktown. I mean, it's probably a 7-Eleven part-time job truth drop in the Flava Flav Public Enemy song. Anyway, don't mean to get too stupid, but let's go on. The second major part is, let's just go. I'm not even following the numbers. Number 5 on my diagram of the power cord. I'm trying to go from basic to more complicated. It's working up from the most basic to the more complicated. Number 1 on this diagram is the screen. It's the monitor on the computer, is the outer reality screen in my concentric reality bubbles presentation. And it's simply, the screen, whatever stands behind it, and the minions trying to get our attention. It's everything. I'm not just talking about your television and movies. I'm talking about the presentation of society itself. What's considered a success? What's considered good or bad? Or, all the stuff that comes from the screen down onto society. All this stuff with race now completely cooked up. So the screen, from the people listening to this perspective, we're pretty clear on what that is. There's not a lot of reason to spend too much time on that. Number 2, the main part, the Earth itself. And I'd like to, by the way, before I forget, I want to thank Izzo for helping me through some of these concepts. And concepts that he's been looking at for many years. He didn't even know that I was looking at the same thing until I mentioned a few videos back, and we've been exchanging ever since. So, inside the Earth itself is the tower, say, of the PC. Do they even still have these? I guess they do. I haven't had a PC like that for so long. There used to be a tower on the ground, and that would be the Earth itself. And the most important part inside that is, of course, the processor. Now, this is where I put real human beings as the Intel Pentium 2 processor. The real human beings. In my notes here, I have the processor and likely the programmer and the coder. Or if this is some sort of Matrix or Dream environment or Maya, it's David Lynch's Dreamer. The power, not the physical power that comes from the power source, but the power of the reality manifestation, I believe, comes from the processor. Nothing in a computer comes out unless the processor. That's us, in my opinion. And the basic idea here is, of course, this dark element that exists here just wants to fool the processor into putting out the output that it wants. All right? So we'll come back to this. We're the processor and potentially the programmer and the coder. And of course, for your suggestions and everything and comments, this is going to change a little bit. So let's just keep going. The initial operating system, all right, I have is number 6 here. The initial operating system, the motherboards, would be more the BIOS, and think of that word, basic input-output system, BIOS. Now, in a computer, a BIOS is like the startup program. First thing that starts up allows everything to start working together, like the operating system will then see your mouse and know what the mouse is supposed to do, and things like that. So the monitor works. Very basic BIOS. And think how interesting so you can almost see the word biology in BIOS. even though somebody's going to scream at me and say, "Matt, it means basic input-output system." Well, yeah, but is it a coincidence? It just screams biology. There's a lot of things that these things start matching up in odd ways. Like when we look down at a city, it looks like a motherboard, and this is just one of those areas. So you have the initial operating system, which to me is like nature, the laws of physics, how the wind blows here. If you drop a rock, it will fall. Things that the creeps have no way of changing. There's something laid down here. They're trying to get their virus, and here we go again. We have a computer virus. We have a virus on the reality operating system itself, being mostly carried forth by a human V. And what's going on now with CV? So, to me, this is like the operating system. I hate to use a Melvin Gates reference, but Windows or Linux, whatever. Okay, more like nature or natural law. I don't know exactly how to describe this, but you know what I mean. So that's 6. All right. Now, where the dark element comes in, by the way, on top of the, I don't know how to really show this, but on top, if anybody is looking at the diagram, which you don't have to, and again, it'll only distract you from what I'm saying. I have a projector sitting on top of the tower, and the projector is projecting basically the reality itself, or the way a society moves, based on our inputs, our manifestations coming from the processor, ultimately turns into a projector, which becomes reality itself. So number 3 here I have is a USB port, and this is where the dark element is first. He tries to get its sticky fingers in. You know how it's tapped right into how reality works with its reality buttons and levers. So 3, think of a USB drive, just pushing it into a USB receptacle port. All of its inputs, all the unnatural input, we have nothing to do with the USB inputs. It's created a USB input into reality itself, and it goes back and puts its new viruses on its USB. It's like this slimy, mold-covered USB drive that keeps trying to plug into the port. And it has, stuff like everything's on there. What government is. It's all of its systems, all of its laws, its educational systems, its societal norms, social norms, its definition of success, what medicines are to treat what, how doctors operating inside of a little box where things can only be treated with 3 different methods, not alternative methods or Eastern methods, how to live your life. I mean, it's all of it comes through this USB port that ultimately, it can't affect the operating system too much, but it can kind of create a feedback loop of some kind on the processor, which is the creative power of real human beings. So as long as it creates like a, remember a defragger? We used to defrag computers. I remember doing that in the 90s. Anybody under 40 is like, a defragger? You used to defrag your computer overnight. What the F's that? I don't know. You do this defrag program. You saw these boxes like the hard drive. Maybe you can still do it. It doesn't matter. The hard drive would kind of reconfigure itself, and so you'd have more space, or things would work a little bit more smoothly. I don't know. But it's always through its inputs. It's always trying to rearrange things. So the processor, the creative power, which is us, is running the wrong programs or giving the wrong output to the projector, creating the reality it wants. For example, the board in Star Trek.
These tired old eyes ain't seeing 2 able-bodied young men just lollygagging.
Can you, shut up?
Say what? Now, I know these tired old eyes ain't seeing 2 able-bodied young men just lollygagging.
Can you, shut up?
Say what? Now, I know these tired old eyes ain't seeing 2 able-bodied young men just lollygagging.
Can you, shut up?
Say what?